Some of the most beautiful Bibles ever printed were printed in the early Renaissance. In this video, we're going to take a close look at one particular Bible printed by Jacques Mareschel in the year 1519 in the French city of Lyon. What I'd like to do with this video is tease out a few insights using this Bible about how religious as well as classical texts were being influenced by the rise of humanism. When we think of the Renaissance, we think of it as a time when scholars were busy almost exclusively with the rediscovery of classical texts written by ancient authors. And that's a narrative that's been reinforced by popular history books like Stephen Greenblatt's The Swerve. But the Renaissance had a very powerful influence on the Bible as well. This charming little Bible is one of the neatest in my collection. And I love just taking it out and leafing through the pages and losing myself in its history. Let's take a look at the title page in this Bible. It reads in Latin, Biblia Cum Summariorum apparitu pleno quadrupliquique repertorio insignita. Now, if we were going to translate that very long Latin title, of which I only read a small part, into English, it might read something like this: a Bible adorned with complete summaries and a fourfold index, beyond the most diligent corrections, and specifically in the vocabulary of Hebrew words, where for the most part it was flawed and defective. Marginal additions have been added that mark the annual histories of each nation according to those times. Also added are the cross-referenced canons for the Holy Scripture. And it's signed, interestingly, by Albertus Castellanos. Now, Castellanos was a Dominican scholar born around 1450, and he was, I believe, only the second scholar to attempt a revision of Jerome's Vulgate after Gutenberg printed his first Latin Bible in and around 1455. We're going to talk a little bit more about Castellanos and Jerome's Vulgate as this video unfolds. But I'd like to also draw attention to the really neat printer's device on this title page, which also appears on the last leaf of the Bible. Underneath this device is a neat little 6-line poem by Matthias Sambucelas. And this poem appeared with most editions of Castellanos' text of Jerome's Vulgate. And if we were to translate it into English, it would read something like this. Here shines the whole Bible in clarity amended, truths in the past but partly comprehended, canonical law in Scripture renewed, its tenets with wisdom now fully imbued, old laws and new in fresh light are seen, discovered herein, exact and supreme. And this poem really tells us what this Bible is all about. It's about a revised text, but it's also about integrating the text of the Bible with canon law. And that's an intriguing feature because this is one of the first Bibles to actually do that. And it sort of underscores this Bible's Catholic orthodoxy. Now remember, this Bible was printed at a time when the Protestant Reformation was just starting to get off the ground. Luther had posted his 95 Theses in 1517, so this Bible appears 2 years later in France. And Luther, at this point, had not yet been excommunicated, but people were widely aware of his activities and the disturbances that he was causing, to put it mildly, within the Catholic hierarchy. And so it was pretty clear that with this Bible, Mareschel and the man he was working for, Simon Vincent, who was a bookseller active in Lyon at the time, wanted to make sure that there were no mistakes about where their loyalties lay. Now, in the 16th century, Lyon was a thriving center of commerce, and that included book production. The city's location made it an important trade hub, and that facilitated the distribution of all kinds of goods, including books and ideas. In fact, Lyon was second only to Paris in terms of the size and scope of its printing industry. And it's interesting that some of the most remarkably beautiful Bibles printed during the Renaissance come out of Lyon. Undoubtedly, it was a real center for Bible production, Latin Bible production especially. So, I've already mentioned that this Bible was an edition of the edited text produced by Castellanos. The Renaissance was a time when humanism was evincing a renewed interest in the original biblical languages of Greek and Hebrew. And so Castellanos's edited text was becoming quite popular. And it first appeared around 1505 or 1506 and was printed by a printer by the name of Jacques Mareschel. This 1519 Bible is a direct product of Castellanos' work. Now, this is an interesting fact about this particular Bible. As I said, it was one of the first to offer marginal notes citing canon law, but certain editions of this Bible also contain sort of a section at the end of the Bible after the Bible proper ends, of rhyming mnemonic biblical summaries written by a friar, Francescus Gotti. So these were 4-line verses intended to encapsulate each chapter of the Bible and enhance the reader's engagement and enjoyment of the text, but also shape his understanding. What's interesting is that this Bible does not have that section, and it's not as though it was lost or cut out. Instead, what's here is the interpretation of Hebrew names, and that takes up 38 pages, whereas these rhyming biblical summaries take up 54 pages. And the preliminaries in this Bible are also different. There's 48 pages of preliminaries in this Bible, but in most Bibles there are 30 preliminary pages. So I haven't had an opportunity to examine one of these other Bibles with the 30 pages and then the 54 pages at the end. This one has 48 pages at the beginning and 38 at the end. Nothing missing. The collation is perfect. So what we have here are variants of this particular Bible, and maybe purchasers of the Bible were able to specify what editions they wanted to have in the Bible, and the purchaser of this Bible wanted the interpretation of Hebrew names rather than the rhyming summaries of the biblical verses, which might suggest that this Bible was purchased by a scholar or a student rather than a layperson. So one of the things you'll notice about this Bible is it's very small, and it was published to meet a growing demand for portable Bibles that were affordable, not just for clergy and scholars, and as I said, it's likely a scholar who bought this one, but also for lay readers. And it's important to remember, too, that even though we have this idea that Latin was beyond the ken of most normal readers, I don't think, the evidence doesn't suggest that that was true in all cases. Certainly many prayer books at the time were printed in Latin, and Latin was a language that people were coming in contact with all the time in church services, in government documents, and legal documents. So it wouldn't have felt like a foreign language to people. And also, biblical Latin is not especially difficult, especially New Testament Latin. And all the controversy around translating the Bible into vernacular languages, I think that's mostly something centered in England. Certainly English Bibles were highly controversial, but the Italians had Bibles in Italian, the Germans had Bible in German before Luther. Luther was not the first one to translate the Bible into German. What he was the first one to go back to the original languages and make a fresh German translation. That was what marked his unique contribution to biblical studies and the Bible itself. And of course, his Bible became very popular. But remember, Jerome also had access. St. Jerome, working in the early church, had access to the original manuscripts as well, and was a scholar of Hebrew and Greek. So the Latin Bible isn't just another translation. It's a very special one because it was made at a time when Jerome had access to original manuscripts in the original languages that have since been lost. So even when Renaissance scholars returned to make corrections to Jerome's text or otherwise produce new translations of the Bible into the vernacular, they didn't necessarily have access to texts that were as good as the ones Jerome had. Perhaps they were, but I think it's unlikely that in all cases that they were, simply because another 1,000 years had elapsed and 1,000 years for textual corruption, opportunities for textual corruption had intervened. So the other thing you'll notice about this Bible, I mean, undoubtedly Mareschel and Vincent wanted to make an inexpensive Bible, but they didn't want to just make a cheap Bible. They wanted to make it visually attractive. And the Renaissance is also known as a time when art experienced a rebirth, and that extended to the printing of books and Bibles in particular. There were many illustrated Bibles being published in the early Renaissance. This is an example of I would describe it as a modestly illustrated Bible. It has a lot of historiated woodcut initials, some of which are quite remarkable. At the beginning, historiated woodcut initials are basically large letters that appear at the beginning of paragraphs, and they're usually illustrated with an animal or a human figure or some sort of plant or flower. And they're sort of modeled on those elaborate initials, historiated initials that you can find in medieval manuscripts that were done by hand. Now, typically, historiated woodcut initials were generic and they could be inserted anywhere. And what they helped the reader to do was navigate the text because they indicated when a new section was beginning or a new paragraph, or if something was particularly important, it might have a very large historiated woodcut initial. But most of them were generic, and they had to be in order to make it practicable to use them in a large book like the Bible. But there are some unique ones in this particular Bible which are really charming, especially at the beginning of Genesis. So if you take a look at this small historiated initial underneath the woodcut of God in the Garden of Eden, you can see here replicated in this little initial God creating the universe. There is another historiated initial further down the page where we can see God drawing Eve out of the side of Adam. And then if we look on another page, we can see Adam and Eve, and between them is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and Satan is tempting them there, which sort of conflates a number of different threads within that early narrative, but still does illustrate in a remarkably charming way that story. And these initials really couldn't be used anywhere else, and so the fact that they would be created here really indicate how important the printers believed that this was to creating a beautiful, usable, and engaging text. There are also some great larger woodcuts in this Bible. For example, the largest and the most impressive is the 6-part full-page woodcut of the Creation, which faces Jerome's commentaries to the Bible. And here we can see the 6 days of creation. We can see the figure of God moving through the work of creation. It's interesting, too, the way God is represented here. This was a very popular motif or style or woodcut, if you want to just call it that. It was used first by a Venetian printer named Luciano Ginta in his Italian Bibles in the 1490s. Then Ginta used it in his first Latin illustrated Bible in 1511. And it obviously had a big influence in Lyon, and printers in Lyon commissioned their own versions of it. This is a slightly more elaborate and complicated version of it than we find in Ginta. And subsequently, we find this also being used in folio Latin Bibles, much larger ones like the ones printed by Jean Crespin in 1527 and 1529. So this was a very popular image, but of course, for Protestants, this was not okay, because Protestants in general were iconoclasts, and especially when it came to images of God. And so in English Bibles, for example, what you'll find when you see images of the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve, that's okay. But God himself is represented just by the 4 Hebrew letters that make up his name, Yahweh, called the Tetragrammaton. So the woodcuts are very charming. They appear also at the beginning, smaller woodcuts at the beginning of Genesis and Proverbs and the 4 Gospels and the Apocalypse. So what were considered really important books have their own little illustrations. And you can see that the evangelists appear with their symbolic figures or animals to indicate who they are. I particularly like the one for the Apocalypse where you have the angel looking over John's shoulder and saying scribe, which is Latin. It's a Latin imperative meaning write. And anyone who's been a graduate student will know what it feels like to have that angel always on your shoulder saying write, write, write. So all of these visual elements then reflect broader trends in Renaissance art and culture, a period characterized by this renewed interest in visual representation, at least on the Catholic side, and a belief in those images to convey meaning and inspire devotion. So what do we have then in this really great little Bible is a volume that is an instantiation of the confluence of old and new. It's a time-honored text. It's Jerome's text of the Bible, but it's been revised in the spirit of Renaissance humanism, not to improve on the text, and this is an important point. It's not to improve on Jerome's text. It's to recover the purity of Jerome's original translation. So this isn't about innovation so much as getting back to that original, they wouldn't have called it inspired, but really the next thing to it, Jerome's inspired translation of the Bible. And then we see all these illustrations which indicate that Renaissance influence on creating something that is aesthetically beautiful. And then the fact that this was produced using what was still innovative technology of the printing press. So it's really an artifact of a transformative era. We find here in this Bible not just an old book then, but a tangible testament to the enduring and evolving power of both the image and the word.